Most of us want to learn things as fast as possible. I know I did because I was a serial crammer. But when I started to take my learning more seriously, I realized that rushing things was actually holding me back. And then I read Make It Stick. And this book is based on decades of scientific research on real people, and it shows us the habits that we think help us actually make it harder for us to remember anything at all. I've actually seen this in my own learning journey where I thought things that were improving my learning were actually just slowing me down. And after reading this book, I realized it just comes down to these 3 strategies that help you learn more efficiently. And the surprising part is they go against everything we think we know about learning fast. While reading Make It Stick, I noticed something immediately that clicked with me. It explained why when I started cramming and I thought I was being smart about it, it wasn't actually working. Looking back, I would say cramming did sometimes work when I was just looking at content a few hours before the exam, and then it literally saved me. But more often than not, there were a lot of times where I would wake up for the exam after having crammed for a whole night, and then I'd sit there in front of the paper with a pen in my hand and I wouldn't be able to recall anything. And honestly, it brought tears to my eyes in a few exams. So clearly, it's not a very reliable way to learn. That's when the book introduced me to a method called retrieval practice, and it completely changes the way your brain learns. Instead of just rereading and reviewing your notes, you have to actually recall your notes. You quiz yourself, you can write down what you remember, or you can explain it out loud. And this is harder than skimming your notes and just reading the information, and that's exactly why this works. The book shares a study where some students learned some scientific facts. One group was just simply rereading their notes on the subject, and one group was quizzed on the content multiple times. And a week later, the students that were quizzed more recalled more information than the group who hadn't been quizzed. Actively recalling that information strengthened their memory in a way that rereading couldn't. Looking back at me taking my maths exams for university, I have actually experienced this working for me. In the math-based modules that I took exams for, you'd have to do loads and loads of practice questions, practice papers. And because I was actively recalling how to use the formulas again and again, that made me perform better in those exams rather than ones where I just had to cram information. So really, if I had applied that same logic to the information-based exams, I probably would have performed better. The key takeaway from this is that retrieval practice makes you pull information from your brain rather than just repeatedly reading something passively. It's really about the brain more actively working. And this naturally sets up the next strategy, which is related to the timing of when you revisit what you've learned. Whenever I was learning new topics, I would always just read about it and then think, yep, I've got that, and then move on. But while reading Make It Stick, I realized this was another reason why me thinking I'm learning fast was actually slowing me down. It introduced me to this idea of spaced repetition. So revisiting your material in different time intervals rather than just cramming it all at once, which I've pretty much been doing my whole life. And the key is to space out you recalling that information in long enough intervals that your brain has to struggle to remember it, because that struggle is what is helping you learn. The book gave a really concrete example of this. It was students learning foreign word pairs. One group spent one very intensive session learning all these word pairs, and the other group had spaced their sessions over a week. And weeks later, the group that remembered more was the group that had spaced out their sessions rather than done one really intensive session, because those spaced out sessions made their brains work harder to recall that information. And that is exactly why it sticks. And in hindsight, I've actually noticed this myself. When I'm making YouTube videos about tech topics, I have to learn about it first, then I have to script it, then I have to revisit it, read it through. That's why these topics get really cemented in my head because I'm actually recalling information, and from the time I learned about the topic to actually creating the video and editing it, there's been a substantial amount of time between it. And then because of that, it is reinforced into my memory. So the key takeaway here is that it's not just the effort you're putting into your learning, it's the timing which is just as important. Revisiting the material in spaced intervals might feel slower, but at the end of the day, you retain more knowledge, so it's a more effective way of learning. And this leads to the third strategy, which takes this principle even further and kind of mixes things up. Whenever I would start learning a new skill or about a new topic, I would always kind of really focus on that subject until I felt like I had mastered it and I felt like I'd put enough time in. And yes, I completely understand this subject. That to me felt pretty logical, you deeply focus on something and then you can move on to the next topic. But as I was reading this book, it introduced me to something called interleaving, which challenged that initial logic that I had. Interleaving is about mixing up different topics or types of problems rather than just sticking to one. The book showed studies that students working and practicing on mixed problem sets performed better than the ones that had just been focusing on a single type. And the idea is that switching between different topics strengthens the connections and improves problem solving. And I can really relate to this because as a software developer, when I'm thrown into dealing with a whole project and I'm looking at logic, I'm looking at UI, I'm looking at the back end, all of this feels quite hard, but that is when I found that I learn the most. Because it kind of forces my brain to see how different things work together and almost gives it a bit more context, so it's easier for me to remember how it works together. Working with the bigger picture just feels like it sticks in my mind a bit more. The key takeaway here is that interleaving forces your brain to become really active and flexible and kind of learn in a very usable way. You don't just learn about one topic in isolation. Instead, you give it context and it then in turn gives it more meaning. And combined with the retrieval practice and the spaced repetition, this trio of strategies will actually help you learn more effectively. Even though it went against everything I felt about learning fast, I realized after reading this book that it's really faster to learn in this way because it's more effective. And this is why cramming and focusing too narrowly on something might feel productive, but it often isn't. And if you're going to take one thing from this video, it's that the fastest way to learn isn't cramming. It's to work smarter and embrace those strategies that might feel a bit counterintuitive, but make your brain learn in a more meaningful way. Let me know in the comments if you've ever used these strategies or in hindsight you've realized, yeah, I've actually noticed that myself. But other than that, I'll see you next time.